BrightRock believes that with every change in life comes opportunity, and the budget speech isn't any different. The minister's speech means change for us all, because whether the numbers are big or small, change always counts. This budget speech 2023 special edition of the BizNews Power Hour was illuminated by BrightRock, the first ever needs-matched life insurance that changes as your life changes.
Hello there, I'm Alec Hogg and there's Stuart Lohman on the other side. You can see we are at our business partners, the Latitude here in Cape Town. What a beautiful picture that you can see behind.
It's great, Alec. Fantastic weather again in the Cape. Nice and windless, as they say. I'm not sure the budget was as windless, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
We will indeed, and I'll be taking you through the key points of the budget. What will happen is that Stu will be fielding questions and then stopping me along the way to ask me for perhaps a little bit more insight. The presentation is around 15-20 minutes, so it's not very long, and we're leaving enough time for interactivity. And so really good to have members of the BizNews community with us, thanks to our sponsors, BrightRock, of course, who are well known in these parts for their sponsorship of the local rugby team, the Stormers or Western Province, I think one or both of them. But Stu, do you want to just go through all of the technical?
Thanks, Alec. Just on your right-hand side of your screen, you've got a control panel. If you can see Alec and myself on screen and hear my voice, there's a little half-up button. If you can click that half-up button, there we go, Alec. Always good to see those half-halves. And as Alec mentioned, we like to keep it engaged. There is a question mark on that same control panel. If you put your questions through there, I'll pass on to Alec once he gets through the meat of the presentation. But all looks good on the technical front, Alec.
Brilliant. We're having to do a little bit of MacGyvering here. We're sitting in the same boardroom, and when I speak, Stu has to put his mute on, and when he speaks, I've put my mute on. So forgive us if we forget that. I'm sure we are going to be doing our very best. Just to reiterate again, there's a little question mark on your control panel. That's where you type in the questions that you might have, and then it's said before, Stu will actually pick them up with me. Okay, so let's go on to the presentation itself. And as you can see, BrightRock are happy sponsors. Let me start with the good news. And the good news is that in 2 years, you got to kind of let this sink in. It's only 2 years ago, not even 2 years ago, that South Africans were not allowed to produce power, or only allowed to produce power in tiny quantities. Many of the companies in this country were begging the ANC government for the ability for licenses to put up their own power plants. Neil Froneman, foremost amongst those with Sibanye. The ANC said no. The only power plant that you are allowed to build is a size of 1 megabyte, which is, 1 kilowatt, which is tiny. It's far too small for any business to make the investment into becoming independent of Eskom. That's 2 years ago. 2 years ago, the thoughts of asking the private sector to get involved in supplying electricity to South Africa were restricted to the renewables field, where renewable energy suppliers were brought in simply because the government had to bring them in because of the international pressure. Why? Because the ANC believed in a capable development state. Capable development state. Remember those 3 words, because they have now been confined to the dumpster of history. Like most socialist fantasies, they cost a heck of a lot of money, and eventually they're shown to be inexecutable. And this supposedly capable developmental state in South Africa is now in tatters. The big deal was that the ANC would control the supply of electricity, which it monopolized through Eskom, And if you recall, it was a similar big deal a decade or so ago, in fact, going on for nearly a decade and a half now, when Telkom used to supply fixed lines and internet access. It was only when we had a second cable that landed in South Africa in 2009 that the internet started picking up in this country after putting this country on the back foot. So it's almost like the ideology got in the way of the economic reality. And if there is one bit of good news out of this budget, it is that that ideology is now not even being considered anymore. What the ANC is doing is asking the private sector to come to the party as aggressively as possible. And starting off with you and I, we are now being paid to put solar panels on our roofs. Up to 15,000 Rand of the cost of the panels itself. Unfortunately, if you're going to buy an inverter, you're getting no benefit for that. If you buy batteries, no benefit for that. The whole idea here is that the country is in such deep trouble on the supply of electricity because the monopoly, the state monopoly, is only producing around 25,000 megawatts of electric power. Whereas I recall in 1994, when we got democracy, Eskom was producing 44,000 megawatts. So you can see what's happened. And the Eskom staff have, of course, doubled in that period, and the salary increases have gone way beyond inflation. On top of all of that, you had state capture, where Eskom was pillaged by the Guptas and their pals. So it really has been a mess of monumental, gigantic proportions, which has cost the country, you'll see in a moment, taxpayers over R500 billion confirmed. That's money gone out of our tax cut that has gone through bailouts, and now yet another bailout on the Eskom loans. But the good news is you're now being paid to put solar panels on your roof. You might think that 60,000 Rand for solar panels is not really a huge amount. There are plenty of panels. You can probably get most houses quite well equipped with 60,000 Rands worth of solar panels. Remember, for a typical installation, which is about 200,000 Rand to be off the grid virtually, you need batteries and you need an inverter as well, because as the solar panels are producing electricity, they're putting it in through the inverter into your batteries, so that when there is no sun shining, you still have power. The second point about the budget today, the other good news, is that the government has now got aggressive with companies. Remember, less than 2 years ago, it was only in July 2021 that Cyril Ramaphosa said that 1 megawatt, getting these things a bit mixed up, apologies, between megawatts and megawatts and whatever, but 1 megawatt was the maximum size of your plant. Then they relented, and this is in July 2021, to 100 megawatt, which is pretty good, but certainly if you want to get into this market and compete with Eskom, you can't do it with a 100 megawatt plant. Today, Enoch Godongwana, the finance minister, said there is no more cap. And on top of that, we will give you 125% of what you invest as an investment allowance, which you can then write back off taxable income. What that means in effect is that for every 100,000 Rand, or well, for every up to 60,000 Rand that a taxpayer puts into solar panels, government pays 25,000 Rand. For every million Rand that a company puts into renewable energy, could be solar panels, could be wind, that kind of an investment, for every million Rand, government pays effectively 337,000 Rand. So that puts it into context. What a breakthrough. What a breakthrough. It's worth kind of just absorbing that a little bit. Now we move on to the obvious and the not so obvious. that came out of today's budget. I started there at 6 o'clock this morning. Oh, Stu's just signaling. Stu.
Sorry, Alec. Your presentation's on the main slide. It's not moving through the. I think you're on the third slide now. Sorry, I just picked it up now. Also, on the, you mentioned the solar, sorry, the renewables. Tace just wants to know if you can please explain the 125% that company's going to conduct a bit more detail, please.
I've now got in my little box the slides that I can see, so apologies for that. We're only on slide 2, so we haven't missed anything. There it is, the good news, and you can read what that is. The 125%, up until today, what happened was that if you were a company through the 12B investment allowance and you invested in renewable energy, you would get back 100%. So in other words, your full investment. So you put R1 million in, you can write back R1 million against your taxable income, but over 3 years. 50% this year, in this tax year, 30% the next tax year, 20% in the tax year thereafter. So over 3 years, you could write that back, and it was 100%. As of today, you write that back immediately in year 1, and you write back 125%. So if you invest R1 million, you write 1.25 million rand off your taxable income. And that effectively works out at the company tax rate to the government paying you 337,000 rand. That's effectively what happens. So I hope that's clear. It's pretty simple. Government is actually paying you as a company to put in renewable energy, to get you off the grid, to get you producing. There's nothing here, and I say yet, because we know what's happening in Cape Town. Jordan Hill-Lewis, the mayor, is saying that he is now very soon going to be buying in electricity from anybody who can supply the grid in Cape Town, and where Cape Town goes, the rest of the country is sure to follow. There's nothing on that on a national basis yet. Perhaps they've left that to the municipalities. But what the government, the central government, is saying is, we're in a hole, we need to get out of it quickly. We're in stage 6 load shedding for the rest of this year. The more of you that can generate your own electricity, the happier we will be, and actually we'll pay you to do it. So solar panels, you can get them put up in weeks, I guess. And if there were hundreds of thousands of South Africans who took advantage of this, that would immediately start taking a little bit of pressure off the grid. If businesses like Neil Froneman and others, and there's already 9,000 megawatts that is in the pipeline that is being built in renewable projects, if that were to be accelerated, then that would, first of all, government would be quite happy to pay that money. They've set aside 9 billion rand to pay both individuals, 4 billion for individuals, 5 billion for companies. They've set that aside. They're quite happy to take that, to provide that tax incentive only for this year. You've got to make the investment this year, because I guess we'll have to see what it's like next year. If they're overwhelmed this year, then there's no question that they would reassess it. I did ask the question in the press conference today on precisely that. Can they give us more detail? Where did they get the idea from? Where did they look? And the Treasury guys, who remain very impressive, it's this little pocket of excellence in our public sector, explained that they've looked all over the world. They had to balance things out. They didn't want to give too big an incentive because they have a finite tax cake. And this, what they've put onto the table now, is such a massive change from the ANC policies of the past. But what it does do is align this country with best practices internationally. So it'd be interesting to see how it goes from here. Hope everything's going swimmingly. Stu, is it all coming through okay?
Everything's good, Alex. So just on the renewables, Tace just wants to know, you're talking about the 370,000 that you as a company can claim back. Can you please explain? I don't know if he knows where it comes from. Is it all?
Okay. All right, so let's just start. The example that was used by Treasury in the documentation today is of a company that invests R1 million into a renewable energy production facility. Could be, let's just for argument's sake, say it's solar panels, batteries, whatever. R1 million is invested there. That R1 million you can write off against taxable income. So you've got to be a taxpayer. Your company's got to be profitable in the first instance. You can write that R1 million off again. Sorry, not R1 million, 1.25 million rand, 125% of your investment. You can write that off against your taxable income this year. So government really wants you to do this. And then if you go back to the 18% of the write back, so the 28%, not 18%, we wish, but the 28% company tax rate, if you write that back off against the taxes that you would ordinarily pay on profits, that is equivalent to 337,000 rand. You can do the sums yourself on your phone. That's how it works. Very simple.
Thanks, Alec.
Shall we move on? Shall we move on to the next? And it is good news, and it's something to celebrate. I think for me, it is hope that we are finally having economic practicalities and realities superseding political ideology. We have labored in our country under this foolish economic policy where just about everything possible has been done to spike the guns of those who are productive in the society. And the people who've been benefiting are those who suffered under the apartheid regime. Now, you can argue morally, there's no argument about this, but the problem is if you don't have economic growth, the people who suffered under apartheid will suffer even more into the future. And we have got a situation in the country where we are looking, according to the Treasury, at 0.9% economic growth this year, 0.9%. Our country is growing the population to 1.6. So what that means is then you take our GDP and you divide it by the population, we're going backwards this year because GDP's up, economy's up 0.9, population's up 1.6. So there's less of a pie to go around. Next year, the projection, 2024, is that the economy is going to grow by 1.5%. So once again, population is growing faster than the economy. That's a recipe for revolution. That's not a recipe for happiness. And as a consequence, what we are seeing is that the ANC ideology, finally, nearly 30 years later, is saying, oops, we probably got it wrong. In fact, we did get it wrong because we can see it. The proof is in the pudding, stage 6, load shedding. So I get hopeful. I love my country. I love the people of my country. I think if you can just unleash the human potential of South Africans, why should there only be, there certainly isn't only one Elon Musk to herald from this wonderful part of the world. So that's what gets me excited. Let's go into the obvious of today's budget. Since 2009, South Africa has been running what is called a primary budget deficit. Okay, that means that the money that is being spent by the country, excluding interest, take interest aside, because that's the full balance. So interest one side, the money that is spent was greater than the money that came in. So that means since 2009, South Africa has been running a primary budget deficit. That's really not good because not only are you spending more than you're getting in, but that excludes the interest that you're paying on your debt. And by the way, that's now sitting at 18 cents in every rand that is spent. Sorry, every rand that comes in income tax, 18 cents of every rand in tax, not income tax, all taxes. 18 cents at every rand gets used to repay our debt. And I'll show you that in the less obvious in a moment. But we take the wins where we can get them. And for the first time this year, since 2009, the government will spend less than what it's going to be getting in if you take interest out of the equation. I mean, it's a really stupid model, But at least because you've still got to pay the interest, and the interest is like nearly 20% of your total costs. But at least you're moving in the right direction. And as you can see, the excitement amongst the Treasury guys is that we're finally moving this thing in the right direction. Now, 2009, of course, you know all about who came to power in 2009. And the less obvious story here is that since 2009, our debt, and this is used as a percentage of the economy, just so that you can get a feeling for what it is relative to other countries. Our debt to GDP, when the unlamented Jacob Zuma, economic ignoramus, was appointed as head of the ANC and then the country, was at 26%. So what that meant was that, of course, we were paying interest, but the debt was relatively low, 26% of our economy. That debt is now sitting at over 70%. And as a consequence, from going from around 8 cents in every rand of taxes that came into the government that was spent to service your debt, we're now sitting at 20 cents. And that's really the reality. This is the dirty picture of South Africa. Those years from 2009, where we had a government that spent money by adding to the public sector, giving public sector increases way above the inflation rate, stealing, we know all about state capture, and insisting, despite many warnings, that it alone should be supplying electricity to the country through Eskom and railways and harbors. Again, we've got the worst harbors. I think our major harbors are in the bottom 5 in the world, of more than 300 harbors that are looked at. We've got that as well. So we've got this government that has been absolutely shocking. And you can see since Ramaphosa came in, he had the misfortune of running straight into a COVID pandemic or lockdowns. And that meant that the debt to GDP ratio surged because the economy was not performing. And so there wasn't any or very little tax income relative to what was being spent. And the guys who still got paid right through the pandemic were the public sector. So the public sector and, of course, social grants. So everything the public sector spent on, that continued to be paid, but they weren't getting the money in from taxes because us guys in the private sector were not generating normal revenues because we were told to stay at home. Okay. But anyway, it is what it is. And here you are looking at the most recent time where there was a decline in the debt to GDP ratio, but that's now gone back up again as a consequence of Eskom's debt being put, or 256 billion of Eskom's debt being put into the government debt pond. So we as taxpayers have taken that on. I'll tell you about that in a moment. But this is the not so obvious thing that you must never lose sight of. Of course, it's lovely that the country is now, excluding interest, spending less than it's getting in taxes. But what's not so lovely and what must never be forgotten is this disaster that our debt has just rocketed through some appalling things that have been visited upon the people of South Africa. Here's another obvious. We've had 3 years and another 3 years coming, 2023, 24, and 25, of much more money coming in than had been budgeted for by the Treasury. So you can see there, it started off in the year to February. The way the government works is they go up to February of every year, the fiscal year it's called, February 2022. You can see there was an overrun in revenues of nearly 20 billion rand, which is good numbers. This year, the overrun is almost 100 billion. It's projected it's going to be another 100 billion next year and another 100 billion the year thereafter. So these are big numbers. Where do they come from, though? That's the not so obvious thing. And this is something that we need to stop and look at. The South African corporate sector, for all the criticism that it's given for not, by Rob Herzog, for instance, for not standing up and being counted and not calling out the politicians, it is a very efficient machine, particularly the mining sector, which has done incredibly well during the commodities boom under almost impossible circumstances. Imagine you're in mining, you're sending people down into the pits and down into the tunnels every day. You've got to keep them cool, but you haven't got electricity coming in. And when you produce electricity, you're only allowed to produce a certain amount. So you have to close down whole sections of the mine because of stupid government rules. Because you can't keep, you've got to keep the tunnels cool. You've got to keep people push through air conditioning, which costs money, which costs diesel, and so on and so forth. And yet, once you get the minerals out of the mine, you then have to rely on Transnet, whose service is shocking. They can't get the stuff to the harbors for you. And then if it gets to the harbors eventually, usually trucked, then you've got the problem of actually trying to get through or wade through the treacle of the public sector which runs the harbors. So it's like the government is a dog in a manger, where, well, I'm going to do it. I don't care how bad I am in it, but I'm going to do it anyway. And the cost to the country of all of that has been incredible. Even so, the corporate sector in the last year generated 75 billion extra in income tax than had been budgeted. And that's by far the biggest windfall bonus that came into Treasury. Personal income tax, also 13 billion. These are big numbers. 13 billion. Up customs duty, I found that quite interesting. Also 13 billion ahead of what was anticipated. So someone somewhere is importing. Perhaps it's got something to do with people saying, well, you know, Eskom's not going to be producing the power, we may as well. So importing solar panels, anything that you can, generators, because that customs duty increase is big on 61 billion on what was budgeted. Dividend tax, 8 billion. It shows how well the mining companies have been doing, because when they pay dividends, the dividends get taxed as well. Sin taxes, property taxes. Look at that for property taxes. That was an interesting one. There are people who are buying at the top end of the market, and where you pay up to 13% now on the value of the transaction for the property. 11% if you over, well, for many people, they're paying 11% now in the middle classes. And then you can see on the other hand, government has subsidized the fuel levy. That's been well discussed. And then the one thing we should all be scratching our heads on and worrying a little bit is VAT came in below budgeted. Now that is either because the economy is just so messed or buggered, but it could also be an escalation in people not wanting to pay VAT. That is something that is increasing, was mentioned increasingly in the press conference today and in the material from Treasury, was that crime is becoming more and more of a threat and a risk to this country, even though it's already a pretty big risk. But there's the reason why the taxes were better than anticipated, and indeed why that tax take meant that we are showing at last a primary budget surplus, first time since 2009. On to the next little obvious and not so obvious. There it is, rest in peace, Eskom. You know, the more you think about this, the government is now almost panicked into getting South Africans to produce their own electricity. It's had to, but even so, it's sowing the seeds of Eskom's destruction, because at some point in time, it just makes sense that there's going to be so much electricity produced by the private sector, because you open it up, you let that genie out the bottle, it's not going back in. And the price of renewable energy is falling all the time. So if you're a municipality like City of Cape Town, and you start, or you now are negotiating, as Jordan Hill-Lewis says, he's got 500 megawatts. 500 megawatts, that's a sizable power station almost on its own that is going to be coming into Cape Town. He says they just dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. and that'll be announced in the next few weeks, then that's 500 megawatts that Eskom's never going to be producing in future, and so on and so forth. But the whole idea, the socialist policy of we will be the monopoly, is turning Eskom into the next Telkom. That's obvious. At what cost, though? My goodness, those numbers are quite scary. Taxpayers, according to the information that we have in the budget papers, have bailed out Eskom to the tune of 263 billion rands so far. And today a fresh bailout was announced. For the next 3 years, all of the debt and the interest on the debt, so the debt that needs to be repaid and the interest on that debt from Eskom will be paid by taxpayers. And that's another 254 billion rand. These are big numbers. 500 billion, that's like, you know, serious numbers. I want to just take you back a few slides and you can see, for context, we pay in a full year, everybody who pays income tax, personal income tax in South Africa, add it all together, that's 600 billion. That's almost like taking all of the income tax, all the PAYE, everything we paid as a society, and you put that into Eskom, into that bottomless pit to bail out Eskom. And you don't know if it's going to work. That's the worry about it. It's more than, if we didn't have Eskom and the problems we paid, we wouldn't have to pay VAT for a whole year. In fact, a year and a few months. Kind of puts it in context here. The not so obvious on that side is Transnet is next. Have a look at these two dirty pictures. This is from the Treasury's own data. On the left-hand side is the collapse in what Transnet is actually able or has been moving through its trains. Look at that, it's collapsed. I mean, we're back to time, we're back to below 2010, what Transnet was generating then. So you've got to look back at the miners, at the South African corporate sector and say, how did you guys do this? How did you actually achieve what you achieved given the circumstances that you're in? Well, it's quite obvious when you look at the right-hand side and when you drive anywhere in KZN or Mpumalanga, and you'll have a look at the trucks on the road, and look at that. The increase in the average daily coal trucks, and it's not just coal, you've got iron ore, chrome, many other purveyors of minerals. It's all being trucked, not all, but there's a heck of a lot of it that used to go on rail that is now being trucked to the ports. It squeezes the margins of the companies, but they need to get it to the port and get it out to the international market. And the numbers there, it looks a little bit like the load shedding graph, which is very similar, where load shedding has just gone through the ceiling. But it's almost like you get to a point where things just, things just collapse. And this is the not so obvious. They threw a lot of things at us about what Transnet's going to be doing. There was nothing there that stood out for me to say that they actually understand what deep trouble they're in at Transnet. Eskom, they know. When you try and poison the CEO and you call him, Gwedi Mantashe, interestingly enough, came into the press conference today, walked in there, was very visible by his presence. Apparently the reason he was there was he'd been asked to come along because the economic cluster ministers need to speak with one voice. But he certainly made an entrance. Onto the final obvious and not so obvious. And this is one that'll make your blood boil when you hear about the immigration figures. Social grants, we've now got 18.5 million South Africans who receive 248 billion in social grants. The COVID relief, disaster relief, 350 Rand a month, which goes to also millions of people, that's been extended. There was never really, with an election coming up next year, any chance of that being dropped. It's one of those things, you give people 350 Rand a month, they expect to continue, even though COVID is long forgotten. Community development is the fastest growing area, we were told. It's growing at 8% per annum in the next 3 years, so it's way above inflation. And then, of course, you've got the public sector wage bill, which is 760 billion Rand a huge drain on public resources. And we've seen in many times that the Treasury has told us that the public sector wage bill is something which has been growing at significantly above inflation. That's obvious. We know all about that. But what we don't know is this. And this is the latest estimates of individuals and taxable income. And if you look at this table carefully, you'll see that there are 408,000 South African taxpayers who earn R1 million a year or more. That's 83,000 Rand a month. Nice salary, but certainly not what you would say is going to take you to Hollywood. I mean, especially nowadays, you take off the tax from that, you can probably only afford a house of about 2 million Rand. Those 408,000 taxpayers generate 44% of South Africa's personal income tax. And remember, that's the biggest slice of tax in this country. 44% from those 400,000 people. In aggregate, their contribution is 281 billion. Now, as I said to you a moment ago, and I can go back to that graph for reference, social grants are 248 billion a year. And 18.5 million people who get those grants. So divide the one by the other, and what it's telling you is that for everybody who earns more than 83,000 Rand a month, take home, say, 55,000 or so, they support 46 grant recipients in this wacky socialist kind of structured budget that we have. I wouldn't blame Enoch Godongwana. He's inherited something, and he's actually, in my opinion, doing a very good job. He's holding the line. But actually, just think about every person who emigrates, every skilled person who emigrates, skilled people earning more than 80,000 Rand a month who leave for the UK. Those 46 people who were receiving grants have now got to be shared up amongst the rest of the tax base. And those are the realities and the not so obvious issues that this country faces. So there is an election in 2024, a year from now. Enoch Godongwana knows all about it. In fact, in answer to one of the questions, there he is, second from the left. He said that he knows that this is the election where you can make a difference. Sorry, this is the budget where you can make a difference for the election year. And he said, judge me on what I've done. And you didn't really need to go into much detail to see that there hasn't been vote catching. And for me, that is a huge thing. Stu, I'm just wondering if you wouldn't mind putting on the lights. It looks like we are starting to.
It's not load shedding, Alec.
Get darker and darker. Yeah, it's Cape Town. It's beautiful Cape Town and a beautiful backdrop. But I think that the backdrop is now probably. I've got material here that I'd like to start referencing in a moment if there are more questions. And well, we'll see if Stuart can there we go. We're starting to get to the lights now. So there we go, much better. Thanks, Stuart. Okay, well, that's my presentation. I hope you found that interesting. It was a lot of interesting data that I went through. And I guess now let's see if we can answer any more questions. A little longer than the normal 20 minutes, but I do get excited.
I like the not so obvious and obvious change of this budget. I think it's quite good. Zipo is a positive approach. It says, if only as Transnet did work, we can only imagine the contributions to the tax we would have got if it did work as a railway.
That's a very, very good point, because it's running at around about 60% of capacity. It's a bit like Eskom. Look, the reality is this. We have an ANC government whose ideology is socialism. They comrade this, comrade that. You can still see it's very deeply embedded. And that ideology does not work in a modern economy. You cannot control things from the center. It just doesn't work. Even the Chinese know this. The Chinese economy it's got politically centralized, but the economy itself is run by the private sector. But we in our stupidity, and I'm not going to be sarcastic and call it wisdom, in our absolute stupidity, have dawdled on along a path which has got us to where we are now. We're in a hole. There's no question that South Africa's in a hole. Had the commodities boom not occurred, this country's hole would be real deep now. You'd probably be sitting with VAT at 20%. You'd probably be sitting with immigration rates much higher. So thank you, Big Boss, for the commodities boom. That's helped us. That's given South Africa a little bit of breathing space. The government is taking Eskom on board, giving it breathing space. It's now given up its ideology and said, please come to the party, private sector will even pay you to come to the party. That's a massive breakthrough. And when you then go on to Transnet, what Transnet is being dragged, kicking and screaming into is bringing the private sector into partnership in the same way as Eskom is, I suppose, finding private sector partners in producing electricity in South Africa. It was inconceivable 2 years ago. We've come a long way.
Thanks, Alec. Sheila just wants to know if they broke down the corporate taxes between mining and non-mining. They're concerned with the amount of load shedding, the Transnet issues we've just spoken about, that the volumes could be reduced and therefore profitability impacted in the years to come.
Yeah, there were documents this size, and here's the budget 2023, and I was looking for exactly that. The best I could do was find the numbers that I gave you, but I will keep looking for it, and hopefully I'll stick it into one of our newsletters in the next little while. But it's unquestionably, it's there somewhere. I'll find it, I can assure you. But it's unquestionably, I remember from the medium-term budget statement in October that the improvement was all from mining. It was all from the mining sector. So you can probably extrapolate that as well. The hole is deep. The problems are clear and obvious, but at least now there is a way out. At least now you aren't saying to people who can help themselves, we won't let you help yourself. You're saying to them, okay, we got it wrong. Here's a bit of dosh, please help yourself.
Thanks, Alec. Oratili just wants to ask, did they mention anything about government guarantees for new debt, or is the 600 billion plus the only debt that we're taking on? Much of that helps.
Yeah, there was a lot of conversation about Eskom. There was an Eskom debt, and the complexities of how you can't just take the 260 billion and write it off the 420. So Eskom got debt of 420 billion. That's their debt, outstanding. And the natural thing to say, well, okay, there's 260 billion. Let's just take it off 420, which means only down to 120. It doesn't work like that, they explained to us. Because some of the 260 is going to be to pay for interest, service the interest over the next 3 years, and some of it will be capital. But at the end of the period, what we were told is that Eskom will be sitting with ratios that are aligned with other electricity producers around the world. So Eskom's not going to be without debt. They'll still have gearing, but their gearing will be manageable. And that was the objective that was looked at. There was another very interesting part of all of this where they didn't say who, but an international group of consultants who've done this a lot of times have been charged with looking at the whole coal-fired fleet of Eskom and working out how to fix it. Where do you put in where does it make sense to put in new plant? Where does it make sense to upgrade? And they are then going to, as part of this whole Eskom bailout, the Eskom management team and the new CEO, when he is appointed, and the new Minister of Electricity, when he comes along, is going to be responsible for implementing that plan. So there's a plan. The plan will be presented, will be completed by June this year. So there is an urgency to it. And by June this year, there will be a decision taken on how they're going to handle these coal-fired power stations through global best practice. Not knowing who the consultants are, it's very difficult for us as outsiders, excuse me, to take a view on it. But at least something's being done and something concrete's being done. And there is a roadmap, and there are points of call along that roadmap.
Thanks, Alec. I'm looking for questions for the audience. The question bar is on the right-hand side of the control panel there. If you do have a question, please put it in there. There's a little question mark there as well. Alec, I don't know if there was any mention on immigration as a potential threat to the budget going forward, or?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that I didn't put into this presentation. The one is grey listing. On Friday night, we're going to hear about grey listing. The acting Director General, Ismail Momaniat, who's been really impressive every time I've seen him in the interaction, in the press conferences. In the past, he was like in the audience, and then they'd throw the ball to him and he'd answer that. Now he's the acting DG, so he fields quite a lot of the questions. He left me with the impression that we're going to be grey listed, that it is going to happen. But the grey listing thing, just to put it into context again, it is part of an international body which is responsible for monitoring money laundering and money that gets paid to terrorists. Now, we know with state capture, leave the terrorism part out, but the money laundering, this country is leaked like a sieve. We've known that. And everything that would have been discussed in 2021, when this organization sent its people here to work with the Treasury to have a look at our problems, they came up with 20 problems, 20 issues. Of those 20 issues, 15 have been addressed, primarily through legislation. But the big one that hasn't been addressed is how you got these laws, and it's a typical South African story. We got all these wonderful laws, but we don't implement them. So you got the laws, how are you going to implement them? It doesn't help anybody in the rest of the world if you've got, you're unable to actually apply your own laws. Hence, the aggression with which the Treasury and the state sector are going for people like Marcus Jooste. The attack that is happening on criminals on state capture. We were given updated figures, and they're very impressive. The number of state capture criminals who are on their way to court. The Commissioner for for SARS, South African Revenue Services, Ed Kieswetter, said that they've got a conviction rate of over 90%, and they've got hundreds of these guys that they are now taking to court. They've got back 3 billion rand, okay, not huge amounts of money, but at least they've got that back, but they've got a lot more than that that has been frozen. So there is progress. Of course, not at the rate that we, the public, would like to see. We, the public, wouldn't have wanted state capture in the first place, but there is progress on that side. So as far as grey listing is concerned, 15 of the 20 issues have been dealt with. There are another 5 outstanding. Treasury is confident that those 5 can be addressed in the next few months. If the country is grey listed on Friday night, they have already put in a request to the global organization that they reassess South Africa's figure at the situational compliance at the next meeting, which is in June. So you almost got the feeling, okay, you know, we are trying to get our act together. We haven't got there yet. We're going to be grey listed, which is going to increase the cost of capital, but not permanently. And maybe the financial markets around the world will say, well, okay, they're going to get their act together in the next 3 months, next 4 months. We won't really penalize South Africa yet, but it's very much front and center on that. As far as the immigration is concerned, there's been quite a lot of movement now on remote visas. I know it's something that the DA goes on about, people from Mayor of Cape Town and the Western Cape, because they can see the potential. We're sitting in Cape Town now, and you see how many foreign people are here, and not just here on holiday, who actually live here now, because it's a great place to live when you've got the connectivity. The problem is you need a visa to stay longer than 3 months. And there is progress on that side. That was actually mentioned in the budget today as well. It's part of the plan to get South Africa moving again. So it's like this army ants. You've got all these ants out there, and they're all working in their own way. And there are lots of little things happening. But the big thing is the ideology of it's ours and only we can do it has finally been shattered. I wrote today that the last rights were administered to Eskom's monopoly by the president in July last year. Today, the coffin was put into the ground. Eskom's monopoly will never return. It's being buried.
Thanks, Alec. You mentioned Ed Kieswetter SARS. That was one of the shining lights. I know you mentioned it's a little, not as much as we need, but it was one of the positives in the budget. And before the budget, there was a lot of talk of the wealth tax, and that obviously didn't come up in discussion today, or did it?
Well, it's a good point, Stu, because I can tell you if Treasury is publishing this graph, this table, they're looking at this table and they're saying, oh my goodness, what happens if those 400,000 people depart? Remember, when you're a socialist country, you don't really think anything more than we hate people who've got money. That's what your mind is going to. When you become more in touch with the financial realities of a modern economy, you start saying, who's giving us this money? Where's it coming from? Oh my heavens. Are we losing the people who are paying us? It's like at BizNews, if our advertisers, if our premium subscribers emigrate, for each premium subscriber who emigrates, after a while they say, okay, I like South Africa, but actually I've got a new life in Canada, wherever. I don't need to be a premium subscriber to BizNews anymore. And if we had a flood of people who were emigrating, or of our subscribers who were emigrating, we would be doing what we could if we had the ability to keep them in the country. And that's what, that penny has dropped. You know, I remember Pravin Gordhan a few years talking about follow the dots, join the dots. What's happened here is it's almost like you could say, penny has dropped, and they've realized, as Maggie Thatcher did, that there's a Tina factor at work here. There is no alternative. So you just better get off your backside and get on your bicycle and start fixing things and start doing the things that are politically uncomfortable, but just have to happen. Otherwise, from the BizNews premium context, when you wipe the sleep out of your eyes, all your premium subscribers are sitting in Canada and they don't want you anymore.
Thanks, Alec. There's no more questions on the control panel side. I'm not sure if there's any, we've got 5 more minutes left on the webinar. I'm not sure if there's any sort of last comments or for the budget.
I feel sometimes that we're in the last, what do they call it, last chance saloon as South Africans just too often. And it's in covering, I actually wrote in one of the pieces today, the very first budget I went to was in 1983. It really ages me. I'm sure there are people listening to this who weren't even born at that stage. But at that time, we had a finance minister called Owen Horwood, who was the brother-in-law of Ian Smith of Rhodesian UDI fame. So you get the picture. That was a different era. It was a different time. It was a completely polecat economy. When you went anywhere, as a young journalist, when I traveled around the world, you try to say you were English or Australian or New Zealand or whatever. You never admitted to being South African, especially if you have a white skin. And it was just not a comfortable country to be in. And the way that the economy or the budgets were managed then were just as bad as they are today. Money was being spent very fruitlessly on things like protecting the borders. So it's like the ideology of the apartheid regime was just so wonky. And we have a similar thing now with the ANC as well. But when a political party comes to realize, as FW de Klerk did, and his national party in 1989, that they've been getting it wrong, that they need to change, that they need to cross the Rubicon, as if P.W. Botha was supposed to do in '85 and never did. But when a political party can kind of grasp that reality, amazing things can happen. When we look back at the changes in our country from the time that F.W. de Klerk got up and made that very famous speech where he said he'll unban the ANC, release Nelson Mandela, and move to a democratic society. Those next couple of years were turbulent, but then we had an incredible run. And then we messed it up through ideology again. And I see a parallel here. The next couple of years are going to be turbulent. Load shedding stage 6, now we're here at stage 8, stage 9, whatever. I mean, 10 hours a day, we don't have electricity. Just normal now, that's normal. And soon it could be 12, maybe even 14, who knows? But we are paying for the sins of an ideology that is long bankrupted. It could have been worse. We could have had a political party that doubled down on that ideology going into an election next year. The fact is that political party has said, we know we got it wrong. So to me, it's a little bit like FW and the National Party circa 1990, with the ANC circa 2024. And one day, I believe we'll look back on this budget and this moment and this period of the last year and say that was where South Africa turned around. So yes, last chance saloon again. But this time, you really can think that there's enough there to believe that it is different, because once you unleash the private sector, you let the genie out the bottle, there's no putting it back in again. You can only play that socialist card up to a point. We've got huge challenges to come. Social grants, a public sector which is massively overstaffed and overpaid. Maggie Thatcher had to go through difficult times to get that under control, to get the British economy from the sick man of Europe into, at one point, before Brexit, the strong man of Europe, or the healthiest. So we've got a journey ahead of us as South Africans. But at least, to paraphrase Hitler, better not say Hitler, Winston Churchill, it is not the beginning of the end, but it is the end of the beginning. And that's the way I feel. Maybe you look at me in a year's time and say, what a moron. I don't believe that life is worth living if you don't have hope. But this time, there is true reason to have hope that the penny really has dropped. And we're moving into a new world.
Excellent, thanks, Alec. I think that's a fantastic message to end with. And thanks again for your time. I know it's a long, I don't know if it's your longest day of the year, but it is a long day for you from the early lockups and stuff. So, and thanks for all the insights you always bring. So we'll get the video up on YouTube as well as soon as possible after.
Thanks, Stu. Thank you, Stu. It's lovely to be in Cape Town. I so enjoyed this day. The Treasury guys are incredibly professional. The information is there. They got it. They got the speech to us at 11 o'clock today, which helped a lot. So they make, and by letting you in at 6 o'clock, they actually make your life easier. There's a lot of complexities, a lot of things to work through. But if I can understand it and I can share it with our community, then at least we can kind of see things in perspective, unvarnished. But by doing that, you know then how to plan for the future. And if I'd been the kind of person who'd been telling young people of South Africa, go and find a future elsewhere, a year ago, certainly 2 years, I'd never do that, but I'd say go and learn skills and then come home. But say 2 years ago, and there was a strong reason why people could say that. Today, I would at least have pause. And that, if that's it, if that's the only message that comes out of this budget today, then I think something big's been achieved. So thanks again for coming along, BizNews community. I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.
This Budget Speech 2023 special edition of the BizNews Power Hour was illuminated by BrightRock, the first ever needs-matched life insurance that changes as your life changes.